Tonight's speaker has had an amazing life. She is a retired colonel from the Air Force. She taught history at the Air Force Academy for several years. She got her master's in history from Brown University, and she is almost about to finish her PhD in history at University of Iowa. The topic of the talk tonight is the same as the topic of her dissertation, which is also the topic of a book that she is writing to be published by the University of Illinois. And the topic is Bloomer Girls, Women Baseball Pioneers. She is now on the faculty, as you can see, of John Witherspoon College in Rapid City, South Dakota. And one other thing I might add is that she acted as an advisor to Ken Burns when he produced his Emmy Award-winning documentary, Baseball. And she is largely responsible for winning that Emmy Award. So with that, I want you to welcome Debbie Shattuck.
Good evening, Yachats! I learned that, I think, last night. First of all, I want to thank all of you for making my mom and I feel so welcome here. My mom's sitting in the back corner over there, Helene Fakin. You think I drove a long way to be here from Rapid City, South Dakota. She drove all the way from Vermillion, Ohio, so she went about twice as far as I did to be here. But Mom's been my research companion for many, many years. I first started researching women baseball players for my master's thesis back in 1986, 87. And continued a little bit while I finished up my Air Force career, but we really dove back into it again when I retired in 2008. But she has found many, many of these little blurbs about 19th century women players as we go through just reels and reels and reels of microfilm. She's got an eagle eye, and I just greatly appreciate everything she's done for me there. As we walked around the town today, I was just so impressed with the friendly spirit here, and I couldn't believe how many people are transplanted here from near Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I grew up. You know, Mom was born in Amherst, I was born in Lorain, and it seemed everybody we asked, where did you come from? Oh, I came from Ohio. Whereabouts? Oh, near Cleveland. So it's like, wow, that's wonderful. But anyway, as Dave said, I'm going to talk to you tonight about women baseball pioneers. I hope that I am going to just blow your mind tonight, quite frankly, with some things about baseball and women that you probably never knew. And just to give you a little background, as I said, I grew up in the Ohio area, northern Ohio, and I wasn't really that interested in sports too much growing up until 5th grade. I was going to a school that gave a free set of Indians baseball tickets to any kid that got straight A's. And so I happened to get straight A's in 5th grade, and I got these 2 baseball tickets in the mail. I'd never been to a game, but I ended up going to my first baseball game at Cleveland Old Municipal Stadium. And I will never forget walking up that ramp, and many of you who've gone to a professional baseball game probably remember the first time you walked up the ramp at that stadium and first saw that field. It's just magical. And
they'll have the same experience walking.
Oh, I expect so. And oh, by the way, that reminds me, I do want tonight to be interactive, so I don't want you to just sit there for an hour, okay? I have many, many slides, but I don't have to show them all, so we'll just get as far as we can. But I want you to ask questions or make wisecracks as I you, so that you don't forget your question later on. So yes, please do make this interactive. But anyway, so I was kind of hooked, and Mom was a big baseball fan. My dad didn't really watch baseball, but so Mom and I started watching baseball games on TV, and I absolutely fell in love with Ray Fosse And the neighbor boy and I would go in the backyard and play catch, and I'd be Sudden Sam McDowell, and he'd be Ray Fosse, and then we'd switch places. And I mean, the Indians were in the World Series every other week in our little backyard there, thanks to Ray and Sudden Sam. But I still hate Pete Rose, by the way, for what he did to Ray Fosse in that All-Star game. I mean, just totally uncalled for. But anyway, so I kind of grew up. I played baseball with the neighbor boys when they didn't have enough boys to make the team, just in the street and what have you. And then when I was in high school, or maybe it was junior high or early high school, I remember I became an umpire for some Little League teams. But it didn't last long, because the first game that I stepped foot on that field to umpire, I was the umpire out in the field. I wasn't even behind the plate. And the horrible things that were said to me by the players, by the fans, by the managers. What are you doing out here? Girls don't belong out here. You know, and just even way worse stuff than that. And that, I mean, that was really the first time this naive girl realized that I was not welcome on a baseball field. And I never forgot that experience. And quite frankly, I stopped listening to the Indians. I stopped watching baseball on TV for many years because I was deeply wounded. And the dream of ever becoming Sudden Sam McDowell or Ray Fosse was gone. And I never went back to try to umpire another game. But I did play sports. I was very active, played basketball, volleyball, softball, all through high school, all through college. But always in the back of my mind, I wondered, how come I'm not allowed to play baseball? You know, a softball is harder to grip than a baseball, and yet supposedly girls are smaller than boys. Why aren't we using the smaller ball? And let me tell you, I had a college teammate whose nose was broken by a hot grounder in softball. That ball is not soft when it hits you. The one you guys are going to use is soft, but softballs are not soft. So I just didn't get it. Why aren't girls allowed to play baseball? Well, one thing led to another, and I did join the Air Force, and the Air Force Academy sent me to Brown University to get my master's degree, and I had to come up with a topic for my thesis. And I didn't know what to write about. And one evening, I'm flipping through the channels on the TV, and a PBS special on the All-American Girls Baseball League came on. And I watched it, and I was absolutely fascinated. Oh my goodness. You mean to tell me women were once paid to play baseball? And I immediately had my master's topic. I wanted to find out more about this league and see if I could figure out what had happened. Was it still going on? Why weren't girls still playing baseball? So I started doing my research, and I went to the Cooperstown Hall of Fame library and to find out more about the team. But what ended up happening is they had a manila folder there that had just a bunch of random clippings in it. And one of the clippings was from a girls' baseball game in 1883. One was about a game in 1875. And there were just some other random clippings in there, and I'm saying, wow, you mean women were playing baseball in 1875? That's unbelievable. So I ended up expanding my master's thesis, and I covered the period from 1866, which is when what I thought then was the first women to play baseball at Vassar College in 1866, all the way up through 1950 for the demise of the All-American Girls Baseball League. So, and since then, I've expanded the chronology quite a bit, as you're going to see here. But before I get into the 19th century portion of the talk, which is really what I specialize in with baseball history, I thought I would just take a moment to tell you a little bit about the difference between the movie A League of Their Own and the reality of the All-American Girls Baseball League. How many of you have seen the movie A League of Their Own? Many of you, so you're familiar with it. Just a few things to tell you that movie is wonderful. And many of the women who actually played in the league at the very end of the movie, where you see the women in the scrimmage game at the end, many of them were the actual players from the league. And I had an opportunity to go to their 50th reunion in 1993, and they're just a wonderful group of women. But the key differences. During World War I, Major League Baseball kind of got a bit of a black eye because it resisted having the players go into the draft and join the military. The team owners kind of fought against it. They were looking for waivers for their players. And so baseball, it kind of got a bad reputation that they weren't patriotic, they weren't supporting the war effort. When World War II came around, they were absolutely adamant that the players were going to do their bit and support the war effort. President Roosevelt was not in favor of granting waivers for Major League players. So worried that the baseball owners believed it was important for the morale of the public back home to keep baseball going. So Philip Wrigley, who at the time was the owner of the Chicago Cubs and the chewing gum magnate, so that's your first difference from the movie, because if you remember the guy in the movie, he sold chocolate. But Philip Wrigley, the chewing gum magnate, got together with some other team owners and they decided that they would create a professional women's baseball league to play in the major league stadiums for the fans while the men were off fighting the war, kind of the Rosie the Riveter of the baseball diamonds. As it turned out, they didn't need to play in the major league stadiums because baseball never folded during the war. It was indeed curtailed. Many of the players did go off to the military, and so this is the era where you get some of the players who normally wouldn't have been able to play in the major leagues, and they were able to play. But meanwhile, women's softball was incredibly popular in the Midwest as World War II began. One estimate I saw said there were over 30,000 women's softball teams in and around the Chicago and the Midwest area. And Philip Wrigley knew this. And also, these teams were actually outdrawing the men's professional teams in terms of the percentage of the population of their home cities that would go and watch them play. So Wrigley was actually very shrewd in deciding that this would be probably a moneymaker and a good idea to found this league. So, but there was a key problem here, and that was that the women softball players had a reputation of being manly. Okay, they were big and burly, they wore shorts, they didn't wear makeup, and this was not something that Philip Wrigley and the other owners were going to tolerate. They wanted their baseball players to be beautiful and to be charming. And so that part of the movie was very correct. You saw the scene where poor Marla Hooch, you know, she's not all that beautiful, and so there were some women who did not get to be in the league who were very talented baseball players, softball baseball players, but were not allowed to join because they weren't that beautiful. There were others who ended up quitting the league because they just didn't like the rules that said you have to wear makeup both on and off the field. You had to wear dresses. The uniform in the movie, that was the uniform. These are actual pictures of All-American Girls players. So they had to play in those short skirts. That part was absolutely true. And it's really quite phenomenal. This is Sophie Curris right here. She was known as Tina Cobb because she was a base stealer. One year she stole 201 bases in 203 attempts. And if you think about sliding in a skirt, there's a picture, I should have tried to find it, of the strawberry. I mean, huge strawberry on her leg. They tried to wear sliding pads, but they didn't work worth a darn. And so just very physically demanding. The first 2 years of the league, the women did attend charm school. That is absolutely correct, so the movie got that right as well. One of the differences in the movie, however, they constricted time, so that in the movie you see there's not too many fans at first, and then by the end of the season the stadium is crowded with screaming fans. Didn't quite work that quickly. The first year of the league there were 4 teams. They got about 130,000 fans. The second year the team expanded by 2 teams. They drew 250,000 fans. The biggest year for the league was 1948. They drew over 1 million fans, so it was quite popular by the time it ended. And then gradually, as the war had ended, of course, in 45, and the men are back home, and over time, slowly, the attendance began to dip. The last thing I'll say about the league is, in terms of what game were they playing? Initially, they were using a larger ball, and they were pitching underhand. Then gradually in the next couple years, they began to switch to the sidearm and overhand pitching, and the ball kept shrinking. So over the years, eventually by 1954, they did get to the official men's-sized baseball. But prior to that, it was bigger, and it kind of went down incrementally over time. So it was interesting, but it was 90-foot base paths like the men used, and the same rules that the men used. So it was baseball, absolutely, quite interesting. But the really interesting part is that they were not the first by any stretch. As you're going to see, girls and women have been playing baseball since there was ever a game called baseball. And they have been playing every bat and ball kind of game there has been since there have been bat and ball games. And my goal as a historian of women's baseball is to kind of restore this historical memory, because I am interested in answering the question, why is it still so difficult today for girls to find acceptance on a baseball field? If you stop and think about it, that is really a fascinating question. We are well beyond the turbulent 70s when women were finally able to gain access to many, many jobs that had been barred to them, including in the military. The fact that I was able to become a colonel in the Air Force and be in maintenance, a field which, when I joined the Air Force in 1981, there were only a handful of women who were in the aircraft maintenance field. We now have women flying jet fighters, perfectly acceptable. We have women running Fortune 500 companies, driving race cars, doing every sport you can think of, Supreme Court. But for women who play baseball today, they will tell you they are still given the same kind of vitriol in many cases that I received when I tried to umpire a game. So it's a very interesting question, and I want to try to determine what is it about our national pastime that is so resistant to opening its arms and letting everybody play the game, as other sports have morphed over time to where anybody can play them. So, well, let me just take a running start here. If you're interested in the origins of baseball, I highly recommend John Thorne's Baseball in the Garden of Eden. John Thorne is the official historian of Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball actually has its own historian, and it's John Thorne. Wonderful, entertaining author. He has just a real gift of writing. But he will kind of debunk what you thought you knew about the origins of baseball. Many people believe that Abner Doubleday created baseball at a particular place in time, Cooperstown, 1830s. Not true at all. Baseball, as John Thorne said, sprang up like dandelions. There were bat and ball games in every village and hamlet across the eastern coast, some in the south. Everybody had their own local rules, their own rubbery, shrubbery stadiums and softballs and wagon tongues for bats, and they just did whatever they could do. And had rules, ground rules about if you hit it in the swamp or over in the river. So baseball evolved over time. But baseball is such a unique sport. From the 1850s on, it was already being referred to as the national pastime. And versions of the sport were played that you could recognize as baseball in the 1820s, 1830s. 1840s is when it really began to be codified. The Knickerbockers of 1848 set down rules that are pretty similar to what we play today. And then in every year thereafter, different teams, mostly from the New York area, would get together and they would agree on rules to use, and those rules gradually spread and overtook some of the other bat and ball derivations like town ball and wicket and other types of games. But what John says here is so important, especially for the research that I do. Baseball has been blessed in equal measure by Lincoln and Barnum. And in no field of American endeavor is invention more rampant than in baseball, whose whole history is a lie from beginning to end. So it's all, this whole idea, it's all bunk, tossed up with a wink and a smile. We love our baseball myths. We love them. But one of those myths is that baseball is a man's game. Baseball's not a man's game. It never has been a man's game, and that's what I'm going to show you tonight. Girls and women have been playing baseball since there was baseball. They have been playing bat and ball games since there were bat and ball games. But what has happened over time is we've sort of forgotten that. It's like disappeared out of our memory. The most common word that I run across in my research on 19th century women baseball players is the word novelty. The newspaper would say, "Oh, a novel sensation. There's a women's baseball team coming." Or this girl pitcher over here, what a novelty. Well, guess what? She wasn't a novelty. There had been girls and teams all over the country for decades previously. Even today, it's kind of seen as a novelty when some girl pitcher, like the knuckleballer from Japan, can get out there and strike out guys. It's novel. Well, not really. And that's what, hopefully by the end of tonight, you'll see it's not such a novelty. And part of the importance of writing history is to show that corporate memory that they've been there right from the start.
I'm just wondering whether it's women's or men's baseball from its earliest North American origins. Was it, in fact, is it accurate to say that it was a North American modification of cricket?
No, and that would take a whole talk of itself. I don't know if you've seen the book by George Kirsch, Baseball and Cricket. Excellent book. It talks about the comparisons between the two sports, but they do have very distinctive histories. No, baseball is not a derivation of cricket, or vice versa.
Is it strictly an invention of North Americans?
No, versions of the game were played in England. I have a couple slides here I'll show. Girls were playing baseball in England in the 1700s. So, yeah, nope, it just sprang up again. You have a ball, you have something to club it with, and that's how these games of, the game of baseball eventually evolved. Like dandelions all over the country, but mostly in the Northeast is the game that's spread across the country. Question?
I was just seeing Lewis and Clark, the documentary, the other night, and one line in there says that when they got westward to the Nez Perce nation, they taught them a
Baseball,
game with a stick and a ball, and it was called base.
Yes, that's correct. Sometimes the early version of baseball is just called base. That is true. Yep, fascinating. So one of the big lies of baseball, like you heard John Thorney said, the whole history is bunk. Well, one of the lies is that baseball is and always has been a man's game. And this line here from the Watertown, New York newspaper in 1875, you know what? There are some things a woman can't do. The teaching of centuries have established the fact that a woman can't play baseball. Okay? I mean, this is what they're putting out there. None but a perverted and bald-headed advocate of female suffrage would permit the assumption to dally in his mind that a woman could throw a ball underhanded or attempt to catch one without shutting both eyes just when she should see biggest. Now, how could a delicately reared, white-fingered miss get down in the weeds and dust and pick up a hot daisy cutter waltzing through space at the rate of 20 knots a second? How can an able-bodied young lady jump 3 feet high and stretching her arms up another 3 feet take in a crazy fly without tearing cloth somewhere? Preposterous. Normally I wouldn't read what's on slides, but I worry that in a room of this size you might not be able to see it, so I am going to read in some cases what is on the slides. But anyway, so this is what we are going to debunk tonight, is that the teaching of centuries has demonstrated that women can't play baseball. I'm going to take you far, far back in time and show you women playing bat and ball games and baseball. I'll tell you about some of the different types of women's teams I have found in the 1800s. Give you a few examples, lots of pictures. I think a picture's worth 1,000 words, and we have lots of pictures here of 19th century women players. And also, I have one slide at the end that sort of tries to tie in what I have researched with what's going on today with women in baseball. All right, so here we go. How far back are we going to go? How about the 8th century? When Nausicaa and her virgin maidens went out and began to play ball. Now, yes, this isn't baseball, but it's just demonstrating that even in the 8th century, Homer knew that it wasn't just the boys out there tossing the ball. Here's Nausicaa and her maidens taking off their veils, oh my goodness, and tossing the ball and playing ball out there frolicking around. Jumping ahead quite a few centuries, David Block, who has written a wonderful book, if you're interested again in these early versions of baseball, Baseball Before We Knew It is the name of his book. David has uncovered many, many wonderful finds on early versions of baseball and a lot about early women players, which he has very kindly shared with me. This is from a 14th century manuscript that he found, so that's the 1300s. We have a monk, Franciscan monk here, a nun, getting ready to hand him the ball, which presumably he's going to fungo out to a group of nuns and a monk. Okay? Early bat and ball game, 14th century, women. Nuns, no less. Okay. Here's another one, 14th century. This is an actual photograph of a mural in Milan, Italy. And as you can see here, we have this obviously upper class, very well-dressed woman holding a bat. I don't see where the ball is, but presumably it is there in her hand, and she's preparing to fungo it out to this group of well-dressed women who, if you can tell, they're sort of holding their aprons out or the front of they're going to catch the ball in their clothing, okay? But these are women playing a bat and ball game in the 1300s. In 1801, a man named Joseph Strutt wrote an amazing book about the sports and pastimes of the people of England, and he included many, many examples of women sportsmen. And one of the examples he gave is of a game called club ball. Don't know the rules of that, but as you can see, here's a woman getting ready to pitch the ball to a man here with the club, and a game called handball where you just hit the ball back and forth, and you have a woman and I believe a man there playing that game. Women were indeed sporting people. We tend to buy into the myth that women were always doing what people said they were supposed to do, that women are frail, women are weak, women don't go outside, they stay inside and knit and cook and sew and do all that good stuff. It's only the boys and the men that go out and sport. Well, that is just not true. It is a myth. Women were did enjoy sports, they were athletic, and Joseph Strutt's book points out many, many examples of that. My thesis advisor, Tina Parrott, has written a book about English women from the 17th century and 18th century and some of the sports they do. I love this quote here where she talks about that the girls and women played ball games, they ran foot races, battled one another in prize fights, quarterstaff fights, and sword fights at these fairs. The other thing she talks about in her book, which blew me away, I had no idea, is that in the 1700s, women played cricket. And women's cricket was very popular in England. She has found newspaper articles about games that are to advertise them, and also reporting after the fact the huge crowds that went out to see these women play in the 1740s. And it was perfectly accepted. These women were lauded for their skill at playing cricket. So as you move forward in time now, some of these women, no doubt, did come to the colonies, or some of the colonists that were here, they knew about these women. I mean, it might have been their aunt or their grandmother or their mother who was on one of these cricket teams, or who was out there, you know, running foot races and prize fighting and all that. So it just like dads get out there with their boys and play baseball, and it sort of gets passed on that way. There no doubt were some cases, certainly not as many, but where young girls grew up having a mother or a grandmother who was athletic and enjoyed these kinds of sports. Here's some more examples. Quite a few of these. Again, David Block discovered these. Joseph Strutt, in his book that I mentioned to you, there are few of us of either sex but have engaged in baseball since our majority. Okay, boys and girls in England playing a game called baseball. Yes, it had different rules than the game we play today, but it was still a bat and ball game. This was a wonderful quote here. 1748, this woman who is part of the court of the Prince of Wales writes a description of what they do in the winter months when they can't get outside and do their normal sporting events. What do? They divert themselves at baseball, indoors. And notice right here, she says, the ladies as well as the gentlemen join in this amusement. David Block found this a diary in England sometime in the 1700s, we don't know the exact date, where this young man, William Bray, writes in his diary, after dinner went to Miss Gill's to play at baseball with her, the three Miss Whiteheads, Miss Billinghurst, and Miss Molly Flutter. And then there were some gentlemen who joined in as well. No hint that there is anything improper about this. Do you notice that? All right, so Jane Austen writes, a famous author. She wrote the book Northanger Abbey, and her heroine in that book was described as in this way. Catherine, who had by nature nothing heroic about her, preferred cricket, baseball, riding on horseback, and running about the country at the age of 14 to books. She's what we would call a tomboy. But see, little girls that are growing up reading this book have a heroine now who loves baseball and cricket and jumping horses. In the U.S., what are the girls in the U.S. reading and seeing? Well, Mrs. Jane Marcet was a famous writer of science books, and her books went through multiple printings. She was English, so her books initially were published in England, but they were also then reprinted in the United States. Scores of reprints, chemistry books, science books of various types, selling tens of thousands of copies. So her books were in the early American schools, and girls and boys were reading them. And here's an example. When in one of her science books, the topic was inertia. And this is how her character, Emily, explained inertia. In playing at baseball, I am obliged to use all my strength to give a rapid motion to the ball. And when I have to catch it, I am sure I feel the resistance it makes to being stopped. But if I did not catch it, it would soon fall to the ground and stop of itself. So the important thing here isn't how she explains inertia. It's that, A, it's a girl explaining it, and B, she's talking very matter-of-factly about playing baseball and how she catches the ball. So that's one example of how I am determining that this was not all that novel and unusual at this point in time yet. I ran across an article in 1839. It's a fictional story, but again, it's a story of a girl who at age 12 played ride on horseback. She played ball, pitched quoits, which is like horseshoes, using a round ring, and roll 9 pins. And then I love this one here. This was published in Harper's Weekly in 1859. I did some research on the gentleman here whose name is cited. Francis Gowitz was a dentist in Avoca, New York. And he took issue with an article that had been published the previous month in Harper's in which somebody claimed that, well, I don't see why baseball's being called the national pastime. It's not even played outside of the eastern part of the United States, out of eastern New York. So Gowitz, in the next issue, he writes and says, you know what, you're mistaken. For 20 years, so he's reaching back now to 1839. For 20 years, as long as I can remember, baseball has been a popular game wherever I have lived. The game is a popular one in nearly all the villages among the rural districts of western New York. And he goes on at the end and he says, it is the game at our district schools during intermission hours and often engaged in by youths of both sexes. So here's a dentist in western New York who's saying, yes, this is the national pastime. We love it out here. It's played in Indiana, Michigan, and you know what? At our schools, it's the game. Boys and girls play it. And the very interesting thing I learned as I was doing my research, because when I first started the research, I had only found articles from the 1875 team on, and in almost every case, the press was horribly negative, that these women were burlesquing the game, they couldn't play worth a darn, they were terrible, they were ruining the game, they shouldn't be playing. But what I began to find as I looked earlier is that that negative press wasn't there. It was quite positive. Baseball was seen as a good sport for both men and women. Well, more correctly, boys and girls. Okay? So here's an example that I recently discovered, an article, or actually a letter to the press written by Frances Gage, who is a fairly well-known women's rights advocate of the day. But she went to the Eagleswood School in Perth Amboy, New Jersey to visit. And she discovered that the girls there were joining their brothers in playing baseball. So the girl and boy students at this Eagleswood School were playing baseball. And this school was quite famous. It was a part of like a utopian community. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, David Thoreau, a lot of the very active abolitionists sent their kids there. Theodore Weld, Angelina Grimke, if any of you are familiar with the Grimkes and Theodore Weld, the famous abolitionist, and another, Garrett Smith, who I'm going to talk about later, his sons went to this school. So it was a very modern, forward-looking type of school, and they were allowing the girls to row boats and play baseball and take long hikes. And at the end of the letter, Frances Gage says, hey, when I go back to our school in Danville, we're going to make the principal let our girls take long hikes and play baseball, because this is important. If the mother is very weak, how can her children be strong? So it became, baseball was seen as one of those healthy sports that girls could play to make sure they grew up to be strong women so they could bear children, and healthy children. All right, let's move ahead a little bit to the 1860s. This is sort of the stereotype image we have of upper-class women in the 1800s, and quite frankly, there is truth in it. Clothing was abominable, quite frankly, for upper-class women. The way that they dressed. This type of stance that this woman has is known as the Grecian bend. And it became popular late 1800s, early 1860s, late 1850s, early 1860s. And they actually wore clothing that would force their body into this position, and it was beautiful. Okay? More commonly, of course, the hoop skirts with the sweeping long skirts and the tightly bound corsets to make the waist as thin as possible. This was sort of the fashionable standard of the day. But just as there were women who wanted to look this way, there were women that were fighting against that and saying this is so unhealthy. But let me read you the full quote for these little snippets that you see here. And this is from an article in a newspaper, I believe, let me just check real quick here, for Michigan, November 1875. And here's what the writer says. We are beginning to lose all hope in womankind. The world's teachers have long ago informed us that the woman of the 19th century is laced into eternal perdition, that her heart and 2 lungs are tied up by corsets into one heart that beats as 3, but in a very indifferent manner. Her spine is bent out of shape, and in a way disorganized by the habit of her dress, and gartering above the knee has left her a legacy of very tumultuous maladies, which leads her through a peevish existence to an untimely grave. Horrible, horrible problems from the way that women dressed. They couldn't breathe. They were bent in funny shapes. Can you imagine playing baseball in that kind of getup? They did. And I'm going to share some quotes with you about how they did. And notice some of the photos that I'm going to show you later. Women were playing in long, flowing dresses. But they also played in more sensible clothing. One of the pioneers of fighting against the status quo was Dr. Mary Walker. She's a pioneer, for one thing, because she became a physician in an era when there were very, very few female physicians. There were more than you probably think there were, but there were certainly not as many as there were male physicians. But in the 1860s, women were beginning to enter more and more traditionally male jobs. And one writer in the Iowa State Register wrote in 1867 an article that was called Sexual Assimilation. And he is just beside himself. The world is falling apart. Female physicians are multiplying. Civil offices are filled by women. Occupations which have hitherto been considered exclusively masculine are usurped by them. They become painters and sculptors. They pop the question and institute proceedings for divorce. They look forward to the female millennium of suffrage with an assurance that makes it a foregone conclusion. And our New York girl gamins even are beginning to sell papers and polished boots. From a strictly social standpoint, this nearer approach of the two sexes is equally apparent. Ladies carry canes. They are more out of doors and mingle more freely with gentlemen in their hitherto exclusive amusements. Driving and even riding astride are becoming more and more feminine accomplishments. So are croquet and billiard, swimming and diving, hunting and fishing, walking, rowing and gymnastics. And listen to this, and we shall hear presently of female baseball and cricket clubs. Oh, heaven help us. But I guess this guy didn't know there had already been many, many female players and baseball teams. It was an absolute delight to go to Vassar College back shortly after I had finished my master's degree, because they had a picture of a female baseball team from 1876, which I will show you a little bit later. But I asked the archivist, do you know whether they played earlier than that? And she said, no, definitely not. But my mom and I were there, and we just started going back through old school catalogs and school newspapers, and lo and behold, the very first year that Vassar opened, they opened in the fall of 1865, in the school newspaper for 1866, I found a roster for a female baseball team. So that got me diving into the letters and diaries of every girl that was attending Vassar in 1865 and 66, and I found a letter from a girl named Annie Glidden. She went on to become the valedictorian of her class, but she wrote to her brother John, they are getting up various clubs now for out-of-door exercise. They have boat clubs and a floral society and baseball clubs. I belong to one of the latter and enjoy it highly, I can assure you. We think that after we have practiced a bit, we will challenge the Hamilton boys to a game. Can you imagine what her brother was thinking? So there at Vassar College, this prim and proper college of the upper class, one of the very first clubs that were organized, or two clubs, were baseball clubs. In 1869, and again, this was another David Block find. He was on eBay, and he found this letter from a young man who was attending an academy in Maine in 1869. And you'll notice he writes here, the great excitement over here is baseball and jumping rope. Strange combination there. The boys play at morning, noon, and after school in the afternoon, and the girls play ball as well as the boys. Them that are not old enough to play jump rope. So boys and girls playing baseball together. This is a wonderful image here that Mark Rucker found. We don't know who this image is. I have a sneaking suspicion it could be one of the Vassar players, or it certainly seems to be from the 1860s era, just based on the clothing that she's wearing. On the cap there, there's two letters and then BBC, Baseball Club. So just a wonderful image. I wish we knew more about it. One of the best researched early women's games that we know about has some fascinating backstories to it. In the archives at the Hall of Fame, when I went there in 1987, was this picture. And the caption, which I've blown up so you can read it a little better, said, the last illustration of women's rights of female, spelled kind of funny, a female baseball club at Peterborough, New York, see page 275. And the illustration had another caption under it that said July 1869. And I just gave a presentation at Peterborough last month where I spent the whole time explaining the story behind why it took 15 years to find out about that game. And it was because the July 1869 caption belonged to another picture that the Hall of Fame had cut it was in a scrapbook, a big scrapbook that had 2 pictures. And they had included the caption of the picture below with this picture. This game didn't take place in 1869, it took place in 1868. Once we knew that, we found all kinds of articles about it and learned more about it. The other thing I need to tell you is the game looked nothing like this. The players were not dressed like that. They weren't women. They weren't watched by huge crowds. This was an artist's conception, done for a paper called The Day's Doings, which is like the National Enquirer of our day, okay? Completely different than what actually, here's what actually happened. After years of research, we figured out this is the earliest known mention of the game. How many of you have ever heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton? A few of you. She is probably the most famous women's rights advocate of the 19th century that we know. Her and Susan B. Anthony really helped bring the push for the vote for women. But in 1868, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was visiting her cousin Gerrit Smith in Peterborough, New York. And she had just founded a newspaper called The Revolution with Susan B. Anthony. And she wrote a series of letters to which were then published in The Revolution. This is page 2. She had a full page on the page 1 of that size text, just talking about Gerrit Smith and his wife and blah, 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 things and then almost as an afterthought, on page 2, in the middle of the column, she writes, "We were delighted to find here a baseball club of girls. Nanny Miller, a granddaughter of Gerrit Smith, is the captain and handles the club with a grace and strength worthy of notice. It was a very pretty sight to see the girls with their white dresses and blue ribbons flying in full possession of the public square last Saturday afternoon, while the boys were quiet spectators at the scene." Nothing like what the picture was that you saw earlier. But the caption on that picture, the last illustration of women's rights, it's in the 1860s that I have begun to discern this change in attitude towards women who are playing baseball. It's no longer just the fun, out there for exercise, make healthy women who can bear healthy children. Now it becomes a direct challenge to men's masculinity. How dare they get out there and become doctors and fill civil service jobs and ride horses astride and play baseball? Okay, it becomes more of a gender issue at that point. And I think part of the reason The Day's Doings used that caption, women's rights, is because it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton who had written the article that then spread like wildfire across the country. That many, many newspapers then said, ooh, Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes that at Peterborough this happened. So the article was just carried all over the country. And since she was a women's rights advocate, the assumption was this baseball thing by girls, this is a women's rights thing. They want the vote and they want to play baseball. It probably didn't help that Elizabeth Smith Miller, this is Nanny Miller, the little girl who, by the way, was only 12 years old in 1868, and she was the captain of one of the teams. Her mother, Elizabeth Smith Miller, is the one who invented bloomers. I'll bet you didn't know that. The reason they're called bloomers is that in 1852, I believe it's 51, 52, don't forget, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Gerrit Smith are cousins, and this is his daughter, okay? So they're like, I guess, second cousins. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Elizabeth Smith Miller were very good friends, and Elizabeth Smith Miller designed this bloomer costume, which was really a quite long skirt that went down below the knees, but it did have pantaloons under it. That was the original bloomer outfit. It wasn't called bloomer outfits. It didn't really have a name. They called it the long dress. But she traveled to Seneca Falls, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton was living and where Amelia Jenks Bloomer lived. And Amelia Jenks Bloomer was publishing a newspaper called The Lily. And she began to promote this outfit in her newspaper, urging women, stop wearing corsets. get into a more healthy outfit so that you can move around and breathe and be healthier. And over time, then the critics, of course, start calling this thing the bloomers, and that's how we know them today. But it was actually Elizabeth Smith Miller who introduced the bloomer to Amelia Jenks Bloomer. I'm going to show you on the next two slides just a really quick overview of all the different teams and players I found just in the 1860s to give you an idea of how it was spreading geographically. Anytime you see red, that is the first time that I have found a team in that particular state. So, and the earliest one of an actual organized team, a standalone women's or girls team that I found is at Mills College in California. We don't know absolutely for sure that that was baseball because they called it games at ball. But we do know that 1866, that was definitely baseball that they were playing. One of the girls even wrote to her brother and asked him to send her a glove so that she could play on one of the Vassar teams. And then the Vassar girls had a team the following years as well. And Michigan had quite a few teams. I cannot figure out why baseball was so popular in Michigan in the 1860s among girls. This was an interesting account where the newspapers were saying this girl had died playing baseball. It turned out she had contracted yellow fever, and that's what killed her, but they attributed it to look at that, she's dead because she played baseball. Here's some more teams just again from the 1860s in 11 different states. But here is a graphical representation from 1859 to 1888, all the different teams and players I've found so far. And the more research I do, the list just keeps expanding. The thing that has revolutionized my research is the digitization projects of so many libraries. Just millions and millions of pages of newspapers have now been digitized, and I can search them with the phrase female base or other derivations of that search phrase, and I'm finding articles just amazing. And so I've kind of compiled this visual representation. The Dakota Territory had teams, New Mexico Territory. This is a modern map, so you have to use your imagination there for the territories. Hawaii, they have an article that references girls and boys playing games at ball in the 1840s. And we know that the Good Girls Baseball Club played the Good Boys Baseball Club at Punahou School in Honolulu in 1884. For every type of men's team that there was in the United States in the 19th century, there were women's teams of the same type. Baseball was not just professional teams or semi-pro teams. Baseball was played, as I said before, cities, hamlets, anywhere men could get together, boys could get together, pickup games in schoolyards. There's many, many examples of comical games in the 19th century. Baseball played on ice skates. Baseball played waist deep in water. Baseball, believe it or not, I'm not kidding you, a number of games where one-armed men played one-legged men, especially right after the Civil War. There are newspaper articles about this. One article was men who had lost limbs in railroad accidents playing each other, just all kinds of very strange derivations. And so for every kind of men's team there was, I have found women's teams as well. And I'll just give you a few examples here and what these teams are. I call pickup teams just kind of an informal group gets together. They're identified by characteristics, not by geography, so they don't represent a particular city, for example. This one is very intriguing to me. We have the rosters of the teams, but we still can't be absolutely sure they were women. And because there were so many comical kind of men's games, it is possible that a group of men got together and called themselves the Invincibles and the Women's Suffrage. And the reason I say that is they played this game the week after this major women's rights convention happened in Cincinnati. Dr. Mary Walker was there, Susan B., all these famous women's rights advocates. But it also could have been women. I've gone through the city directories. All we have is a first initial and a last name. And the names are so universal, it's very, very difficult to even identify one of these players as a woman for sure. So, but I do think it probably was 2 women's teams, because we have so many other examples of women playing baseball in Ohio in the 1860s. In Rockford, the married women played the single women. We see that a lot with men's teams, married men versus single men. The women were doing it as well. So these are just pickup teams, organized, play the game. I have one example of a factory team. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, businesses, industry often sponsored baseball teams for men and other sporting teams for women. I have one example from 1878 where a group of women that worked at a mill in Manayunk, Pennsylvania, challenged a group of men, and the game was played there. But I suspect there were more, but I haven't found any yet. The civic teams. These are my favorites, where a particular group will get together in a city and form a baseball team, but they're also my most frustrating, because often this is all I get. That is all I know about the girls' baseball team in Dowagiac, Michigan in 1867. One sentence. My mom probably found that one. That's the kind of stuff she would find. And can you imagine reading an entire newspaper and finding that one line? But she would do it. But we go there, we go into other newspapers, we look at subsequent issues. They never say another peep about it. And it's so frustrating. Who were the girls? Why did they play? How long did they play? How old were they? But many, many teams all over the country playing baseball. The college teams are the most interesting to me, because we can find the most out about the girls. The Vassar teams, I have the rosters of all the players. And of course, many colleges keep very good archives. They trace their players through time, so I'm able to find out how did the girls graduate, how many of them ended up getting married and having kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have some very good demographic information on college players. We already mentioned Charles Hurd there. Vassar College was not the only place where girls played baseball. And in fact, I would say girls had more opportunity to play baseball at the women's colleges than they did anywhere else, because these colleges were very secluded. And I have many quotes, many letters, diary entries of girls playing baseball in the 19th century at various colleges, particularly the all women schools. But they also did play at co-ed schools. I love the accounts by Minnie Stevens. She graduated from Smith College in 1883. But she talks about, in 1879, seemed to me we ought to have some lively games, so we organized a baseball club. It's all about, you notice it's not about women's rights, it's about wholesome exercise and having fun. The same reason boys and men play baseball. It's a fun game. So I talked to you earlier about the girls playing in their long dresses. And Minnie Stevens, as she's at a class reunion years later, and they're reminiscing about their baseball club days. And she talks about how they really wanted to play, but because of so much danger to the windows in Hubbard House, their dormitory, and we were politely ordered to give it all up. Another classmate of hers, Sophia Richardson, talks about how the female physician at Smith encouraged the girls to play baseball, but then when the parents found out about it, they were ordered to stop playing because it was deemed to be inappropriate. But Minnie Stevens talks about one game, and this gives you an idea of what the girls wore when they played, because she said, one vicious batter drove a line drive directly into the belt line of her opponent. And had it not been for the rigid steel corset class born in those days, she would have been knocked out completely. So they played in corsets. And it took a lot of courage for these girls to play baseball. Can you imagine being a young girl in the 1860s or 1870s? This is the kind of stuff that is being written by doctors and reverends. As for training young ladies through a long intellectual course, it can never be done. They will die in the process. Puny, nervous, a struggle between life and death. And this Dr. Edward Clark, there was a firestorm after he put his stuff out. He absolutely said you cannot allow girls to go to college. It will absolutely ruin them. They will die, they will not be able to bear children, etc., etc., etc. And yet, these young girls had the courage to go out there. And one very famous woman, oh boy, her name is escaping me. She went on to be a college president herself, but she said that she was deathly afraid to go to college because of Dr. Edward Clark. But she persevered and went on and didn't die, obviously. But so not only going to school to study, but then playing baseball. It was dangerous, supposedly. But the college girls did indeed play. There's the picture of the Resolutes that really got me started on learning more about baseball at Vassar. This picture was taken in 1899. It's the class of '01. And I don't know who the other players are. These are just some pictures that were kindly given to me. This one here by Joann Kline, who collects 19th century pictures and has absolutely a wonderful collection. The women's professional teams, just like men had professional baseball teams in the 19th century, so did women. But it was a whole different kind of team, at least in the 1870s. Now, the 1870s are an era when the country is really changing. Industrialization is kicking in full steam. We've got immigrants pouring into the country. All sorts of new inventions, the telephone, the phonograph. You can now travel from New York to San Francisco in 6 days on the new transcontinental railroad. But more importantly, men and women are being put in factories in front of a machine, and their life is becoming increasingly regimented. And opportunities for men to demonstrate their masculinity in other ways through their profession or hunting and just all that is beginning to dissipate a little bit. They're stuck in the factory running this machine that anybody could do, and it's very, very difficult. But so sport and leisure time become more available to people. They have spendable income, and industrialization changes sports because now sporting equipment can be mass produced and it's cheaper and it's available to more people. In the same era, baseball becomes big business. The National League is organized in 1876. There have been various other leagues, and there continue to be other leagues, but that was the big one in 1876, of course, still in existence. The Cincinnati Red Stockings, 1869, become the first openly professional teams. Baseball historians now know that teams were playing players under the table for at least 5 to 10 years prior to this. The different leisure time pursuits available to people, the towns would be plastered with posters for circuses and theater and minstrel shows, etc., 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 and women's baseball games, as you will see in a moment. Burlesque was a very unique type of entertainment that came to America in the late 1860s, and it was satire. Burlesque was not the Gypsy Rose Lee striptease stuff that you might think of now. Originally, burlesque was satire. It was Saturday Night Live. It was parodying political and local officials. It was women dressing as men doing satire. And interestingly enough, we begin to see baseball being parodied in these burlesque shows. The first one I've found is 1868, where Tony Pastor, who is known as the father of vaudeville, in his very prim and proper family-oriented theater, he advertises a skit that will feature the female baseball club. I found many, many examples after that all over the country, New York, Cleveland, Ohio. You begin to see these skits with female baseball clubs. A few entrepreneurs figure, hey, if people go to the theater and see skits of women baseball players, how about if we actually staged women's baseball games and get money for men to watch them play? And so that's exactly what happens. And very quickly here, I'm going to show you 4 of what I call professional women's teams. They're not professional in the sense of the men's team, but they're professional in the sense that these women were paid to play or perform, as it turns out, baseball. Many of these women were actually theatrical actresses. They were performers. The very first team that we know of is the Springfield, Illinois Blondes and Brunettes. This was Abraham Lincoln's hometown. I found an interesting article where as these two teams are practicing in Springfield in August of 1875, Robert Todd Lincoln is driving his mother home from the sanitarium, probably right near where the teams were playing. But anyway, it was a group of businessmen that founded the team, so they're entrepreneurs. They want to profit from the interest that there will be in people seeing women play baseball. The team was very short-lived. This is a theme that I have found on these early teams from the 1870s. This is all they played, 1 September through late September. They played mostly in Illinois, a couple games in Missouri. Oh, they were absolutely attacked in St. Louis. Not physically, but verbally attacked in St. Louis. And in fact, the police refused to allow this game to take place because it was on a Sunday, even though men's teams had been getting away with playing on Sundays, but they canceled the second game where several thousand men and boys had assembled to play. The indoor burlesque female baseball clubs continued on. Here's 1879. And at the same time now we have a new ad coming out here where a gentleman named Sylvester Wilson is organizing a professional baseball team to travel around so he can make money on it. This guy was a criminal. I discovered that before that 1879 team, he had been arrested dozens of times. He was a career criminal and scam artist. He had been jailed 12 times in 5 states by 1879. His violations included grand jury tampering, impersonating a federal marshal, blackmail, sending obscene material through the mail, assault, fraud, and railroad ticket scalping. He was 28 years old in 1879, and he had done all that. These are some of the aliases he used. He organized many female baseball teams between 1879 and 1903, when the Society for the Prevention of the Society to Protect Children in New York City finally got him put in Sing Sing for the second time and the final time in 1903 because he kidnapped girls to play baseball, supposedly kidnapped them, underage girls. He fathered children by these girls. It was really quite horrific, but these girls would play for him year after year in some cases. But he organized it, this is before anybody knew what he was all about. He organized a team called the English Blondes and American Brunettes in New York, played from March to May when he was arrested for having sexual relations with 2 of the players, and their mothers came in and got them arrested. So another very short-lived team from 1879, and we'll see more about him later, but down in Louisiana, interestingly enough, the same year, a guy named Abraham Hezekiah decides he's going to make some money off female baseball, and he advertises this big baseball festival that he's going to play. It was a disaster. The players, he hadn't paid them, so they went on strike and wouldn't play in the game until he got some money from some friends and paid them. Afterwards, the newspapers talked about them accosting him because they never got all their money. The creditors got him. And so it was just a disaster. That one didn't work out either. Here's the most successful of the early female professional teams that I have found. Again, in 1879, many of the players that had joined Sylvester Wilson's team in New York went to Philadelphia and joined these teams, the Philadelphia, or the Female Blue Stockings of Philadelphia and the Female Red Stockings of New York. And you will see this team, as you can see, they traveled a long way in just 14 days, played in 7 games. They would play each other. These were exhibition games where they would play each other. In the second half of the season, 2,400 miles, 21 games in 36 days. And this is in the era before flush toilets and fresh showers and clubhouses. These girls would play a game, get all sweated up, get on the train. They'd move on to the next town, get off the train, play again in front of often hostile crowds. They were stoned. They were chased off the field. They had horrible things said to them. But yet some of them came back and played in other years. The most interesting thing that I discovered about this team, they drew more fans than the men's National League teams that year. And here is my what I compiled. I found the game statistics for 23 of the girls' 28 games. The men played 40 games that season. Here's the order that these are the National League teams for 1879, Chicago, Providence, Boston, etc. And this is the order that they finished in. So Providence Grays won the title that year. They were in first place. They averaged 1,100 fans at their games. When the Red Stockings and Blue Stockings came to town to Providence, they drew 1,200 fans for their game there. They did not play in Chicago, but they played in Boston, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Cleveland, Troy, and Syracuse. And I've got the statistics from the newspapers on how many people came to the games. So the bottom line is in the National League cities, the men's teams drew between 914 to 1,171 people per game, fans. The girls, in the 23 games for which I have attendance data, drew 1,400 people to see them play. Go figure. And they, in most cases, they could not play. They were really entertainers. Most of them could not throw, could not run. The diamond was made shorter, the ball was softer, but they were playing a version of baseball and calling it baseball for entertainment value. Most people enjoyed it. They knew it was meant to be kind of an entertaining farce, but others were very angry that they paid good money to see these girls play. The worst case that my mom and I found on this was in 1893, a female team traveled to Cuba to play exhibition games. And in their first game there in Almendares, Cuba, the fans were so angry that this was a farce of baseball, that these girls could not play baseball, that they rioted. They burned the stands, they burned the American flag, they were going to attack the players, but the male Cuban players got them to a house near the field where the fans were stoning the house and beating on it with sticks, and they were going to hurt these girls until the police finally showed up. So that's the worst example we have. And the aftermath of that incident, I actually, in the National Archives, found the letters, the interviews done with the girl players that went all the way to the Secretary of State of the United States about the incident where people, the Cubans had burned the American flag at the baseball game of the women. So, wow. There were mixed feelings in 1871 about whether women should or should not play baseball. Typical portrayal of female players was to ridicule them. You see the way she's shown they're throwing the ball. Of course not all women threw like that. There were many, many talented women athletes in especially the late 1800s. But this is a typical way, oh, they're fixing their hair, you know, they can't really do this right. They're all adept at cotton batting. The girl made a home run. She saw her father coming with a big switch. And this is from that game in New Orleans after Port Hezekiah there. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make organize a female baseball club. So, we have it here that women cannot play baseball. Many parodies. Again, here's a song I found from 1895, and the lyrics talk about, well, of course, who would doubt that I'm a man? I can throw a baseball. I can catch a fly ball. So it's either that women can't play baseball, or if you can play baseball, you are not a woman. You're a man. So it was very difficult for women to be serious baseball players because of these attacks on them. And then you had, in the 1880s, various cigarette companies coming out with these very risque baseball cards purporting to be women players. But in my research, I discovered that they would actually hire actresses who would go into the studio and get the pictures made, and then they would use them. These were not actual female baseball players from the 1800s, and they most certainly did not dress like that. For the remainder of the program, I know we're kind of running short of time here, I'm going to kind of zoom through some. This is the more serious playing now. By the 1880s, especially the 1890s, there were very talented women players. Maud Nelson born in the Austrian Tyrol, came to the United States and had a 30-year career in baseball. She was not only heralded in the press as a genuinely superb pitcher, but she owned teams with her husband. They owned many, many of the Bloomer Girl teams and traveled around. Extremely talented player. The Bloomer Girls teams, I'll show you some pictures here. This is Maud Nelson, that's her husband there. This is Maud up here as the pitcher. There are many, many postcards and posters of women's teams from the late 1800s, and these are just some examples. This is a clip of a postcard that was advertising the St. Louis Stars. This is a typical advertisement in a paper for 1883. This is one of Sylvester Wilson's teams. Here's one of Wilson's ads from 1890, always trying to tout it as this wonderful thing. Oh, we're going to travel all over the world. We're going to do these wonderful exhibitions, when usually the teams would fold after about 3 months due to lack of money. But by the 1890s, these Bloomer Girl teams, they would go for years and years and years. Very popular. They would play in various cities across the country. Well, let me show you one more set of slides here. There's some more of the Bloomer Girl teams. Some traveled in wagons or trucks. Some had their very own palace cars, really nice railroad cars that they would travel in. Now, if you're really paying attention here, you would probably notice that not every Bloomer held a girl. Did you pick up on that in some of those other pictures? Most, look at that girl. That girl. Most of the Bloomer Girl teams of the 1890s had a couple, what they called toppers. They were young boys, girlish faces in wigs. And most of the fans were in on it, not always. The toppers would play pitcher and catcher usually, or pitcher and shortstop. Some of the future Hall of Fame men's players started on Bloomer Girls teams. So it's a quite interesting phenomenon there. And there were, as I mentioned, Maud Nelson. Lizzie Arlington was highly touted as a very, very good, talented female player. Julia St. Clair, just many female players. And I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm zooming through these. But I just want to give you a sense that it wasn't all about the burlesquing and the comedy. Yes, in the 1870s, you just find very few examples of really talented girl players. They didn't really have a chance to grow up playing. But by the 1890s, and on into the early 1900s, very highly respected. Alta Weiss played her first game in Vermilion, Ohio, my hometown. She played on the men's Vermilion Independence and was so popular. I mean, look at the crowds coming out, 2,000, 3,000. These were men's semi-pro teams or just amateur teams. And she would they would run special trains from the surrounding cities to bring fans to come and see the girl wonder, as they called her, 17-year-old Alta Weiss pitch. She was so popular, her father, who was a doctor, bought the team, moved it to Cleveland, renamed it the Weiss All-Stars, and she actually pitched in League Park in front of Nap Lajoie, the manager of the Cleveland Naps at the time. Her uniform is now in the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. They have a whole exhibit of her baseball memorabilia. And she was not the only one playing on men's teams. After, in about the 1890s, I began to see a number of examples of talented girls playing on boys' teams and on men's teams. Alta Weiss was one. There were many others. Myrtle Rowe in Pennsylvania, Ruth Egan in Missouri. Very well-respected players. And this phenomena, if you want to call it that, continued on. Girls continued to play baseball. This is going to be my sequel book when I finish my first one. And just to wrap things up here, it is important that we know our history, our true history, not the mythical history that baseball, there is no nobler or manlier game than baseball, as Harper's Weekly proclaimed in 1867. Girls and women have been playing bat and ball games since bat and ball games were played. And today's women, like Justine Segal, who is the first woman to ever coach first base for a men's professional team, who's the first woman to ever pitch batting practice for Major League Baseball teams. She pitched for the Cleveland Indians in 2011 at spring training. And then a number of other teams, the Athletics, Rays, Cardinals, Astros, and Mets, allowed her to pitch batting practice for them. She runs an organization called Baseball for All, and she's organized girls' baseball teams that play in the boys' tournaments. You got the Japanese girl there who's got a great knuckleball and is being looked at by some of the major league teams. There is a U.S. national women's baseball team that plays every year and travels to other countries where they have a World Series. Girls baseball is actually more popular in some of the other countries than right here because girls are not welcomed to play baseball here. But in Japan, there is a professional women's baseball league sponsored by corporations over there. So I'm hoping that as we learn about our past, our baseball past, that the doors will open and girls will be encouraged to get out there as they are tomorrow to go to the Rubbery Shrubbery Stadium and play beside the boys. And I hope you've enjoyed my talk. I am trying to finish my book. It's been, golly, at least 10 years since I first started. And then when I retired from the Air Force, it's been another 5. But I have 4 chapters written, 3 to go. The research is done. So Mom's going to tie me in my chair, and I'm going to finish that book. If you would like me to let you know when I finally do finish it and it's coming out, you can leave your name and email address. If you are one of those people that changes your email address every other month, I recommend that you leave an address, and I will notify you. I promise I won't use these for any other purpose but to let you know down the road, hopefully late 2014, early 2015, hey, my book is done, and you can get a copy. So that's all I have for you tonight. If you do have any questions, saved up a question, I'd be happy to answer it at this time.
I'd like to advocate for women's softball. That's my favorite spectator game, collegiate women's softball, that I think has tremendous skill, higher batting averages, which means you've got more hitting, fielding. The game's about an hour shorter. And I've been shut out at ASU's women's softball games a number of times with the stadium, including standing room only, has been sold out.
Yep.
So, terrific game.
Still very, very popular. A lot of times when I tell people I'm researching 19th century women baseball players, they say, oh, you mean softball. Softball was not invented until the late 1800s, 1890s. So it's a whole separate game, and a lot of women baseball players will tell you it is a different type of game, and absolutely it still continues to be very popular for men and for women. Any other questions?
This is a pretty, I don't know, might be an interesting question. Did women wear some kind of a protective?
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
Just the rigid steel corset clasp that protected the one girl in 1883.
That is brave.
But yeah, absolutely. They did wear masks. Some of the professional teams had masks very early on. The men didn't even adopt masks, I think, till like 1876 or something like that. So prior to that, just as the men didn't wear gloves, the women didn't wear gloves. They didn't wear masks. Same playing equipment. Okay, if anyone has a question, you can ask me separately afterwards, but thank you so much for coming out.